The Middle East is on fire and the world is holding its breath. A bitter rivalry between two nations, Iran and Israel, has reached a boiling point. But what started as a regional conflict is threatening to spiral out of control, drawing in global superpowers and pushing us closer to the unthinkable World War III. As Iran's nuclear ambitions clash with Israel's fight for survival, alliances are forming, weapons are being readied, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Will the world be plunged into chaos, or can diplomacy still prevent disaster? From the roots of this decades-long conflict to the shocking consequences of war, this video takes you through the explosive situation that could change the course of history. Stay tuned as we explore how this high-stakes drama between Iran and Israel could set the world on fire and what that means for all of us. The roots of the Iran-Israel conflict run deep, embedded in a complex web of historical, religious, and geopolitical factors that have evolved over a century. The tension began with the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, an event that drastically reshaped the Middle East. Following World War II, the United Nations proposed the partition of Palestine, a land that had long been under British control, into separate Jewish and Arab states. This decision was met with strong resistance from the Arab world, including Iran, which opposed the establishment of Israel on the grounds of both geopolitical and religious reasons. Iran, like many other Arab nations, viewed the creation of Israel as a colonial imposition by the Western powers, particularly Britain and the United States, on a predominantly Muslim region. In the years that followed, Israel's existence was marked by continuous conflicts with its Arab neighbors, including several wars, notably in 1948, 1956, 1967, and 1973, further solidifying the Arab-Israeli divide. The situation became even more complicated in 1979, when the Iranian Revolution ousted the pro-Western Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi and brought the Islamic Republic of Iran into power under Ayatollah Khomeini. The revolution fundamentally shifted Iran's political landscape, and Khomeini's new government adopted a staunchly anti-Israel stance. The revolution also transformed Iran's foreign policy, with Khomeini positioning Iran as the leader of the Islamic world in opposition to both the West and Israel. The new Iranian leadership immediately cut ties with Israel, and Khomeini declared Israel an illegitimate state, calling for its eventual destruction. In retaliation, Israel supported the Shah's regime during its collapse, which further entrenched the animosity between the two nations. Iran's ideological opposition to Israel was based not only on political grounds but also on religious ones. As a Shia-majority country, Iran viewed Israel as the embodiment of Western imperialism and a Jewish state established in the heart of the Muslim world. The Iranian leadership, particularly under Khomeini and his successors, espoused the idea that Israel's very existence was a threat to Islamic unity and the broader Middle Eastern order. Iran's support for Palestinian militant groups like Hamas and Hezbollah in Lebanon was part of its broader strategy to undermine Israel's security and legitimacy. Over the years, Iran has provided financial and military aid to these groups, who have carried out numerous attacks against Israel. The situation worsened as Israel's military operations in Lebanon and Gaza, and Iran's increasing support for anti-Israeli proxies, created a cycle of retaliation and growing distrust. This mutual animosity, coupled with Iran's nuclear ambitions and Israel's fear of a nuclear-armed Iran, has propelled the region to the brink of war. The escalating tensions between Iran and Israel have reached a critical juncture, with both nations preparing for the possibility of all-out war. The conflict, which has simmered for decades, has intensified in recent years due to a combination of geopolitical developments, military posturing, and deepening ideological divides. One of the most significant flashpoints has been Iran's nuclear program, which has raised alarm bells not only in Israel but across the international community. Israel, believing that a nuclear-armed Iran would pose an existential threat, has repeatedly warned that it will take military action to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. In response, Iran has continued to develop its nuclear capabilities, citing the peaceful nature of its program, but its increasing enrichment. of uranium and the expansion of its nuclear infrastructure have only heightened Israeli fears. The situation became even more tense after the United States unilaterally withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018 under President Trump, which allowed Iran to resume some of its nuclear activities and led to further sanctions. As the nuclear issue remained unresolved, Iran's military and proxy operations in the region intensified. Tehran's support for Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and various Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria has posed a constant threat to Israeli security. Iran's military presence in Syria, particularly its attempts to build a permanent military foothold near Israel's border, has prompted a series of Israeli airstrikes aimed at neutralizing Iranian forces and their weapon supplies. These covert and overt military actions have further escalated the tension, with both sides preparing for the next round of confrontation. The situation is also complicated by the involvement of external powers. Israel has strong backing from the United States, which has provided it with advanced military technology and political support. On the other hand, Iran is supported by Russia and China, both of whom have strategic interests in the Middle East, and have increased their military and economic ties with Iran in recent years. This global dimension adds a dangerous layer to the conflict, as any direct military confrontation between Israel and Iran could quickly pull in other nations, further destabilizing the region. In addition to military escalation, both nations have engaged in cyber warfare, further exacerbating the danger of unintended consequences. With the stakes higher than ever, the prospect of a broader regional war or even global conflict grows more likely as diplomatic efforts falter and military buildups continue. The nuclear flashpoint between Iran and Israel stands as one of the most dangerous and pivotal aspects of their ongoing conflict, with the potential to ignite a broader, catastrophic war. For Israel, the specter of a nuclear-armed Iran is an existential threat, one that could forever alter the balance of power in the Middle East. Israel, the only nuclear-armed state in the region, has long maintained a policy of ambiguity regarding its own nuclear arsenal, neither confirming nor denying its possession. However, it has made it abundantly clear that it will not allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons under any circumstances. The fear is that a nuclear Iran would not only undermine Israel's security, but could also destabilize the entire region, as Tehran's rhetoric has included calls for the destruction of Israel. In response to Iran's nuclear advancements, Israel has pursued a strategy of preemptive military strikes aimed at crippling Iran's nuclear infrastructure. This includes cyber attacks, sabotage operations, and airstrikes on key facilities in Iran, notably its nuclear enrichment sites in Natanz and Fordo. Iran, on the other hand, insists that its nuclear program is for peaceful purposes, aimed at generating electricity and advancing scientific research. Despite these claims, Iran has been secretive about its nuclear activities, and many of its actions, such as the construction of underground facilities and its refusal to fully cooperate with the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, have raised suspicion internationally. The Iranian leadership has framed its nuclear ambitions as a matter of national pride and self-defense, particularly given the decades of sanctions and isolation it has faced from the West. Furthermore, Iran has repeatedly rejected the notion that its nuclear ambitions are linked to any desire to develop weapons, despite evidence suggesting that Tehran is enriching uranium to levels closer to weapons-grade material. The nuclear flashpoint was further ignited after the U.S. pulled out of the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, also known as the Iran nuclear deal. The deal had placed strict limitations on Iran's nuclear program in exchange for relief from international sanctions, but its collapse triggered a dangerous cycle of escalation. As Iran resumed enriching uranium beyond the limits set by the agreement, Israel, alongside its U.S. allies, warned that Iran's actions could lead to a nuclear arms race in the region, encouraging neighboring countries like Saudi Arabia to pursue their own nuclear capabilities. The situation has reached a boiling point where Israel has publicly stated that it is willing to use military force to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. While Iran has threatened retaliation against any Israeli strike, including potential attacks on Israeli cities and military installations, the stakes are incredibly high. A military confrontation over Iran's nuclear ambitions could trigger an all-out war, dragging in global powers and reshaping the Middle East and the world forever. The path to war between Iran and Israel has been paved by decades of rising tension, a series of confrontations, and an escalating arms race that shows no signs of slowing down. At the heart of this dangerous trajectory lies the long-standing distrust and animosity between the two nations, deeply rooted in political, religious, and territorial disputes. The direct path to military conflict has been fueled by Iran's continued military buildup, its nuclear ambitions, and its support for militant groups that target Israel, including Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza. Israel, fearing that Iran's growing influence and nuclear aspirations could lead to its annihilation, has made it clear that it will not allow Tehran to achieve nuclear weapons capabilities under any circumstances. As a result, Israel has adopted a policy of preemptive military strikes, conducting air raids on suspected Iranian nuclear facilities, arms shipments, and military infrastructure in Syria, aimed at curbing Iran's growing presence near Israel's borders. These strikes, while intended to protect Israeli security, have only heightened the risks of retaliation from Iran, which has vowed to respond to any attack on its sovereignty with full force. The situation is further complicated by Iran's growing alliances with Russia and China, which have provided Tehran with both military and diplomatic support, creating a broader geopolitical dimension that makes any conflict between Israel and Iran even more perilous. This support, coupled with the increasing sophistication of Iran's missile technology and its proxy warfare capabilities, has put Israel in a defensive posture, constantly preparing for the worst. Additionally, Israel's reliance on U.S. support, both militarily and diplomatically, has turned the conflict into a proxy battleground for larger superpower interests, with the United States backing Israel and Iran receiving support from Russia and China. These competing interests risk drawing the global powers into a direct confrontation, escalating the conflict beyond the Middle East and into a broader, far more dangerous world war. In recent years, diplomatic efforts have faltered, particularly after the United States withdrew from the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, further alienating Iran and pushing it to resume its nuclear program. As both sides dig in their heels, the conflict risks spiraling out of control. Each new development, whether it be Iranian missile tests, Israeli airstrikes, or the support of militant groups on both sides, only inches the world closer to war. The military buildup continues, with both Israel and Iran preparing their forces for what many now fear is an inevitable confrontation. The path to war seems almost irreversible, with both countries standing at the edge of conflict, each unwilling to back down from their positions. What began as a rivalry between two nations has now evolved into a global flashpoint, with the potential to ignite World War III as the world watches nervously, hoping that diplomacy can still avert disaster. But as each side prepares for the worst, it becomes increasingly clear that the possibility of war is no longer a question of if, but when. The ongoing conflict between Iran and Israel has resulted in significant losses on both sides, both in terms of human lives and infrastructure, leaving deep scars in the region. Iran, while not directly engaged in a full-scale war with Israel, has suffered extensive losses due to the proxy battles it has been involved in through Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and militias in Syria, all of which have been direct participants in the regional fight against Israel. Thousands of Iranian-backed fighters have died in these proxy wars, especially in Syria, where Iranian forces and their allies have faced Israeli airstrikes targeting weapons shipments and military installations. In addition, Iran has experienced economic losses due to the crippling international sanctions imposed by the U.S. and its allies, which have severely hampered its ability to maintain a robust defense sector, affecting both the military and civilian populations. Israel, on the other hand, has faced the constant threat of rocket fire, particularly from Gaza and southern Lebanon, resulting in numerous civilian casualties and significant property damage. Israeli military casualties are relatively lower, but the emotional toll on the population, coupled with the fear of a major escalation, has been immense. Additionally, Israel has expended considerable resources on military operations, air defense systems, and missile strikes. Economically, the country has faced disruptions due to ongoing security concerns, with tourism and international trade suffering due to the perceived risk of conflict. The losses on both sides are not just military but also psychological and cultural, as both nations grapple with the fear of an all-out war that could expand beyond their borders, pulling in superpowers and regional allies into a catastrophic global conflict. The global consequences of an Iran-Israel war would be profound and far-reaching, extending well beyond the immediate Middle Eastern region and triggering a series of geopolitical, economic, and social shocks that could reshape the world order. The Middle East is a strategic hub rich in energy resources with vital sea routes like the Strait of Hormuz, through which a significant portion of the world's oil passes, serving as a critical artery for global trade. A military conflict between Israel and Iran would likely result in the closure of this key maritime choke point, sending global oil prices skyrocketing and potentially plunging the world into an energy crisis. Nations heavily dependent on oil imports, such as China, India, and many European countries, would face economic destabilization, with supply chains disrupted, inflation rising, and economies teetering on the edge of recession. Additionally, the war could trigger a ripple effect in the global economy, as nations involved in the conflict, like the US, Russia, and China, are economically interconnected with other global markets, and the instability would create a cascade of financial crises worldwide. Militarily, a full-scale war between Israel and Iran would likely involve several regional actors, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and various Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria, all backed by Tehran. Israel, on the other hand, has strong allies in the West, particularly the United States, and its advanced military capabilities would likely be leveraged in any conflict. The US and NATO countries could be drawn into direct military action, especially if Iran retaliates against Israeli strikes, potentially leading to a broader international conflict. As Iran has key allies in Russia and China, their support would further intensify the global dimensions of the war, pulling in superpowers that would compete for influence in the region. A direct military confrontation between the US and Iran could be devastating, possibly triggering nuclear exchanges or leading to proxy wars between Western and Eastern powers. Reminiscent of the Cold War-era standoff on a humanitarian level, the devastating consequences of war would be felt across the globe. The conflict would result in an unprecedented loss of life, with countless civilians caught in the crossfire, especially in densely populated areas like Gaza, southern Lebanon, and parts of Iran. As the war would likely spill over into neighboring countries, millions of refugees would flee the violence, creating a refugee crisis that would overwhelm neighboring states in Europe already dealing with migration pressures. The death toll could rise into the hundreds of thousands, if not more, further destabilizing the region and leading to widespread famine, disease, and human suffering. Moreover, the war would likely accelerate the erosion of international trust in multilateral diplomacy, further diminishing the effectiveness of global institutions like the United Nations, which has struggled to mediate conflicts in the region for decades. The security architecture in the Middle East, already fragile, would be further dismantled, leaving the region in a constant state of warfare and uncertainty. Finally, the war would embolden extremist groups around the world, with both Sunni and Shiite factions seeing the conflict as an opportunity to further their own agendas, potentially leading to a surge in terrorism globally. The long-term effects of an Iran-Israel war would create an era of heightened insecurity, eroding trust in international diplomacy and alliances, and leaving the world permanently altered by the catastrophic fallout of one of the most dangerous conflicts in modern history. The question of whether World War III is inevitable hinges on the ever-increasing tensions between major global powers and the rapidly escalating conflicts that are pushing the world closer to a global confrontation. In the case of the Iran-Israel conflict, The stakes are alarmingly high, and the possibility of this regional war spiraling into a global conflict is more real than ever. With the direct involvement of powerful nations like the United States, Russia, and China, each of which has aligned interests with one side or the other, the situation is delicately balanced. The U.S. has long been Israel's staunch ally, while Iran's strategic partnership with Russia and China makes it a formidable adversary. Any military engagement between Israel and Iran could quickly draw in these global powers, creating a geopolitical crisis with far-reaching implications. The lack of diplomatic resolution and the failure of negotiations over Iran's nuclear program have only heightened the chances of military escalation, and the region is already a powder keg with numerous smaller conflicts bubbling just beneath the surface. If World War III were to occur, the consequences would be catastrophic on a scale unseen since the last world wars. A large-scale war would almost certainly involve the full mobilization of nuclear arsenals. Given the stakes involved, particularly with countries like Israel, the U.S., Russia, and China possessing nuclear weapons, the use of nuclear weapons could result in unimaginable loss of life, widespread environmental destruction, and long-lasting radiation effects leading to a global humanitarian crisis. Additionally, the war would trigger severe economic disruptions. With the Middle East being home to some of the world's largest oil reserves and key shipping routes like the Strait of Hormuz, a war that affects global energy supplies would lead to soaring oil prices, crippling economies, and global shortages. The global trade system, already fragile, would collapse as countries turn inward to focus on survival, leading to massive inflation, unemployment, and the breakdown of international markets. Socially, a third world war would exacerbate the global refugee crisis, as millions of people from war-torn regions like the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and beyond would be forced to flee, creating an overwhelming burden on neighboring countries and the international community. The destruction of infrastructure, roads, hospitals, schools, and homes would set back development by decades. The psychological toll would be immense, as entire generations would live in constant fear, instability, and trauma. The global political landscape would undergo a complete transformation. As traditional power structures are upended, alliances shift, and new political ideologies and systems arise out of the ashes of war. The world would not only face a loss of life, but a radical reshaping of its order, economy, and society, as the scars of World War III would take decades, if not centuries, to heal. The fear of this potential future, with its devastating consequences, underscores the urgency for diplomacy, de-escalation, and a renewed commitment to peace in the face of mounting tensions.